The 16-bit era was all about creativity. While the Mega Drive had speed, the Super Nintendo surprised everyone with its colors, sound, and clever hardware tricks. Developers pushed the system to its limits, creating games that still look amazing today. Here are 10 Super Nintendo titles that made us wonder how this grey box could produce visuals this good. One of the most infamous late-era Super Famicom games is Rendering Ranger R2. Today it's often remembered for its absurd price in the retro market, but the truth is that the game itself is genuinely impressive. It was developed in Europe by Manfred Trenz, the same mind behind the classic Turrican games. Strangely, despite being a Western project, the game was released only in Japan with a very limited print run, which explains why it became one of the rarest Super Famicom titles ever. Originally, the project was called Targa and used traditional sprites, but after the massive success of Donkey Kong Country, the developers switched to pre-rendered graphics, giving the game its distinctive look. Right from the first stage, the game throws you into a post-apocalyptic planet filled with flying robots and chaotic action that feels similar to Contra 3: The Alien Wars. Massive enemies appear constantly, explosions fill the screen, and the level ends with an enormous boss battle. Visually, the game is stunning. The pre-rendered graphics are so detailed that some scenes honestly look like they belong on much more powerful hardware. Even more impressive is how smoothly the game runs, maintaining fast action even with multiple enemies attacking at once. The gameplay mixes platform shooting with space shooter stages. You have 4 main weapons, each with different strengths, and learning when to switch between them becomes essential to survive game's brutal difficulty. When people talk about games published by Sony ImageSoft, it's honestly hard to remember many standouts. Aside from titles like Mickey Mania or the cult Super Nintendo puzzle adventure Equinox, most of their catalog was filled with forgettable licensed games. But hidden in that lineup is a surprisingly solid platformer that many players overlooked: Skyblazer. In the game, you play as Sky, the son of a legendary warrior who must stop the evil Raglan from taking control of the world after kidnapping a powerful princess. The story follows a very classic 16-bit formula: save the princess, defeat the villain, and restore balance to the world. What makes Skyblazer stand out is its gameplay. Sky isn't just another platform hero who jumps on enemies. He fights using martial arts, can cling to walls, and gradually unlocks magical abilities after defeating bosses. These spells range from simple fire attacks to more powerful abilities like freezing time, healing, or briefly transforming into a blazing phoenix that can fly across the screen. Technically, the game is also quite impressive. The colorful environments, detailed animations, and effects like transparency and Mode 7 give the adventure a very polished look for the Super Nintendo. The level design can feel a bit simple and the difficulty isn't very high, but despite those flaws, Skyblazer remains a surprisingly enjoyable platformer and a reminder that even publishers with mixed reputations could occasionally deliver something special. One of the most fascinating gear RPGs ever released on the Super Famicom is Trials of Mana, originally known in Japan as Seiken Densetsu 3. What makes this game stand out immediately is the way its story is structured. Instead of following a single hero, the game allows you to choose one of 6 different protagonists at the beginning. After selecting your main character, you pick 2 companions to join your party. Each hero starts the adventure in a completely different location, which means the opening hours of the game can feel very different depending on your choice. Even the ending can change based on the characters you select, giving the game impressive replay value. The central story revolves around an ancient legend. Long ago, the Mana Goddess saved the world by sealing 8 powerful creatures known as the Benevolents. Afterward, she transformed herself into the Mana Tree to watch over the world. Visually, the game is stunning. The colorful environments, detailed character sprites, and vibrant world design make it one of the most beautiful games ever created for the Super Famicom. Even today, its pixel art still look incredible. Many people remember the endless versions of Street Fighter II that dominated the Super Nintendo. But, near the end of the console's life, Capcom released something that felt like a major evolution: Street Fighter Alpha 2. And surprisingly, a lot of players never even realized it existed on the Super Nintendo. Unlike the earlier titles, Alpha 2 feels noticeably faster and more technical. The fighting system is smoother, combos flow much better, and the introduction of the Super Combo gauge completely changes how battles play out. Once the meter fills, you can unleash powerful super attacks that add a new strategic layer to the fights. The roster is also quite large for a Super Nintendo fighting game, featuring 18 characters, mixing classic fighters with newer additions from the Alpha series, while a few familiar faces from the older games are missing. The variety of fighters still makes every match feel different. One odd technical detail stands out though. When a round begins, the announcer shouts, "Fight!" but the action pauses briefly before the battle actually starts. It turns out the game is loading data between rounds, which is unusual for a cartridge game. It only lasts a couple seconds, but the first time it happens, it can feel like the game froze. Visually, the game is remarkable for the hardware. The character sprites are large and expressive, the stages are colorful and detailed, and the animation is impressively fluid. Combined with energetic music and iconic arenas, the presentation pushes the Super Nintendo far beyond what most people expected from the system. Every console eventually reaches the end of its life. When a new generation arrives, the older hardware slowly disappears, but those final years often produce some surprising releases. Some systems go out with unforgettable titles, however end their run with games that quickly fade into obscurity. The Super Nintendo had a bit of both. While many great games appeared late in its lifespan, there were also projects that looked promising, but never quite delivered. One of those examples is Incantation, a platformer released by Titus Interactive during the final years of the console. At first glance, the game actually seems impressive. The visuals have a distinctive European style, with detailed backgrounds and colorful environments that almost resemble the artistic direction seen in Rayman. Visually, it's easy to think you've discovered a forgotten gem. You play as a young wizard named Max, exploring different stages while using magical attacks to defeat enemies. The game introduces a system where spells can be combined to create different types of attacks. On paper, that idea sounds interesting, but in practice the variety is quite limited, and the combat quickly becomes repetitive. Progression through each level is simple. Collect a few required items and defeat the boss waiting at the end. Unfortunately, the level design rarely offers surprises. Many stages feel short, linear, and often reuse the same visual themes multiple times. Even the enemies and bosses tend to repeat themselves, which makes the adventure feel predictable after only a short time. In the end, Incantation is one of those games that looks far better than it actually plays, a visually appealing Super Nintendo title that never quite lives up to its potential. Few games on the Super Nintendo look as incredibly impressive as Star Ocean. In fact, many players were completely shocked when they first saw it running on the system, because visually it feels way closer to a 32-bit RPG than a typical 16-bit title. A huge part of that achievement comes down to the massive cartridge size and the use of the legendary SDD1 compression chip, a special chip custom designed to squeeze down massive amounts of graphic data. Interestingly, this insane tech was only ever used in two Super Nintendo games in history, Star Ocean and Street Fighter Alpha 2. The result of this wizardry is immediately noticeable. Character sprites are huge, colorful, and packed with detail, giving the entire game an ultra-polished and vibrant look. During battles, the animation is especially mind-blowing because instead of the traditional turn-based style where characters just stand static on screen, fights here happen in real time, with characters moving around freely while pulling off fast attacks and abilities. Magic and special techniques add even more spectacle to the mix, often filling the entire screen with dramatic visual effects. The enemies and bosses are also creatively designed, featuring distinctive animations and movement patterns that really help them stand out. Honestly, the environments deserve just as much praise. The overworld keeps the exact same perspective used in towns and dungeons, making the whole world feel much larger and more cohesive. Whether you're exploring lush forests, barren deserts, snowy landscapes, or lively towns, everything is filled with color, giving the planet Rogue a sense of life rarely seen in Super Nintendo RPGs. Despite a few minor technical issues like occasional sprite flicker during busy effects, Star Ocean remains one of the most visually ambitious games ever created for the system, a perfect example of just how ruthlessly developers could push the hardware to its absolute limits. Among the many platformers released for the Super Nintendo, Demon's Crest stands out as one of the absolute most unique. What's crazy is that this game is actually part of the Gargoyle's Quest saga, which itself is a dark spin-off of Capcom's legendary Ghosts and Goblins franchise. But this time, instead of controlling the famous Knight Arthur, the spotlight completely shifts to one of his iconic enemies, the Demon Firebrand. The entire story revolves around powerful magical relics known as crests, which are connected to elemental forces like fire, earth, water, air, time, and the sky. After defeating a massive dragon in an epic battle, Firebrand finally manages to obtain them all, but his victory is short-lived. While weakened from the fight, he gets brutally ambushed by a rival demon named Phalanx, who steals the crests and shatters Firebrand's power. That ultimate betrayal sets the entire adventure in motion. Determined to reclaim his lost strength, Firebrand begins a brutal journey across the demon realm, battling vicious enemies and recovering each crest one by one. What makes Demon's Crest especially interesting is its open structure. While it's fundamentally an action platformer, the progression is surprisingly non-linear. As Firebrand regains new crests, he unlocks unique abilities that allow him to backtrack, revisit earlier areas, and access previously unreachable paths, giving the gameplay a structure that feels surprisingly close to a modern Metroidvania. Each crest completely transforms Firebrand, granting him wild combat abilities or changing how he moves, allowing him to glide, smash obstacles, or survive under special conditions. Combined with its hauntingly dark atmosphere, detailed pixel art, and challenging gameplay, Demon's Crest remains one of the most memorable and ambitious action platformers ever released on the Super Nintendo. For me, one of the absolute best games that really shows what the Super Nintendo was capable of is Axelay. Even today, it's hard not to be completely impressed by what this game manages to pull off on 16-bit hardware. One of its most distinctive and legendary features is the way it brilliantly mixes gameplay styles. Some stages scroll vertically with a crazy pseudo 3D effect, while others move horizontally, constantly shifting the pacing and keeping you on your toes. This variety completely prevents the action from ever becoming repetitive, making every single level feel totally fresh. Visually, Axelay is nothing short of remarkable for a 16-bit title. The detailed sprites, beautifully layered parallax backgrounds, and dramatic screen-filling effects create a sense of depth that was rarely ever seen on the system. Combined with its hauntingly atmospheric soundtrack, the game perfectly captures the intense feeling of a high-stakes science fiction adventure unfolding right on your screen. Another huge highlight here is the unique weapon system. Instead of just brainlessly upgrading your firepower, the game forces you to think carefully about which weapons to equip for each specific situation. Different stages and complex enemy formations demand totally different strategies, adding a surprising layer of tactical decision-making to the classic shoot-'em-up gameplay. Although the game can be brutally challenging, it rarely ever feels unfair. Success comes entirely from learning enemy patterns and mastering the tight mechanics, which makes every single victory feel incredibly earned. Even decades later, Axelay remains one of the absolute standout shoot-'em-ups on the Super Nintendo, a perfect example of how developers were able to push the console to its absolute hardware limits while delivering a thrilling and unforgettable experience. The cartoon Bonkers was never one of my favorites from the Disney afternoon lineup. It wasn't terrible, but when you grow up watching something like Darkwing Duck, the competition is tough. Because of that, I never paid much attention to the Super Nintendo game based on it, but after finally giving Disney's Bonkers a shot, I realized it's actually a pretty solid platformer. The story begins when several valuable magical artifacts disappear, including the famous sorcerer's hat from Fantasia. Bonkers and his partner Lucky start investigating the case, but things quickly go wrong, and Bonkers ends up handling the mission completely on his own. Gameplay sticks to classic platforming ideas. Most enemies are defeated with a bounce attack, which quickly becomes your main tool throughout the entire adventure. There's also a dash move that lets you burst forward, smashing enemies and objects in your path. It's an incredibly fun mechanic, even though the game doesn't explore it as much as it could have. Bombs are another important tool in your arsenal, especially against stronger enemies and bosses. Since they're limited, you actually have to think a little about when to use them, which adds a bit of strategy to the mix. The levels themselves are themed around different Hollywood-style sets, which gives the game a nice variety of environments to explore, with some paths even rewarding players who take the time to search for extra items. In the end, while the cartoon never stood out to me, the game turned out to be a pleasant surprise, a simple but highly enjoyable platformer on the Super Nintendo. This one simply couldn't be left out, right? For me, Chrono Trigger is easily one of the most beautiful and impressive games ever released on the Super Nintendo. When it launched in 1995, it showed that RPGs could be far more dynamic, cinematic, and engaging than many players expected at the time. The story follows Chrono, the main character, who unexpectedly gets pulled into an adventure that goes far beyond anything he imagined. What begins as a simple event quickly turns into an epic journey through time. Throughout the game, you travel across completely different eras, trying to stop a catastrophic threat that could destroy the entire planet. One thing I always appreciated about Chrono Trigger is its combat system. Unlike many RPGs of that era, Enemies appear directly on the map instead of triggering annoying random encounters every few steps. That small change makes exploration feel way smoother and gives battles a much more natural flow. Another element that makes the game stand out is how the story brilliantly evolves across different time periods. Each era introduces brand new characters, unique conflicts, and gorgeous environments, which keeps the adventure feeling fresh the entire time. And of course, there's the famous legendary ending system. Depending on exactly when you confront the final boss and the choices you make along the way, the story can conclude in several different ways. In total, there are 13 possible endings, which adds a massive amount of replay value to the experience. In the end, Chrono Trigger isn't just a great Super Nintendo RPG, it's one of those absolute masterpieces that truly defined an entire generation. So those were 10 Super Nintendo games that pushed the system further than most people realize. Some of them may not be the most famous titles on the console, but they prove just how incredible the Super Nintendo library really is. If you enjoyed the list, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which one surprised you the most.